Excellent, thank you. Declarations of interest. Is there any declarations that any members need to make in relation to the agenda today? None showing. Thank you. We have no statements from the...
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. It's a relatively short paper. Members will know that the Strategic Investment Plan was considered at their previous board meeting following the consultation which ran during the summer and early autumn. And constituent authorities are in the process of taking the final SIP through their own democratic processes, and that will come back in March for you to consider. Meanwhile, over the period since we last met, work has continued with the other 6 STBs, working jointly on matters such as decarbonisation, but also specifically with Transport East and England's Economic Heartland on Bus Back Better and decarbonisation toolkits. And probably like local transport authorities, we await with interest to see the local transport plan guidance that is expected at some time during the spring. We've also been progressing work again jointly with other STBs on the capacity and capability aspects around centres of excellence to start to set out what regional centres of excellence look like to support both local transport authorities and that's a sort of broader programme. There's been a couple of events taken place detailed within the report. And there's been some changes to the Transport for the South East core team. So Matt Jasper has joined us as a scheme and development manager, supporting Sarah, and Emily Bailey has been appointed into the Centre of Excellence project manager. We are also we've just recruited a transport strategy manager who will be joining on the later on in February. And Chairman, it's just worth noting that this will be Holly Farley's last board meeting. Holly's been our communications and media manager, and she leaves Transport for the South East at the end of February to become a deputy head of communications for East Sussex County Council. But Holly's been a really important member of the team, and just worth noting and thanking her for her work. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I guess from my perspective, that's a bit of a mixed blessing, having Holly moving from TFSE into my authority. So welcome, but we're enjoying. Are there any comments or questions anyone want to make on what Rupert has just said? None?
No.
And so we're just asked to note the activities of Transport South East between November and January 2023. So if we're happy to do that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes.
So we now move on to agenda item 6, which is the SIP delivery plan. And if we get Sarah to introduce the overview of the SIP delivery action plan and the common analytical framework and its monitoring and evaluation approach. So Sarah, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. So the purpose of this report is just to provide an update on work that's being done to support the delivery of the Strategic Investment Plan. Delivering the investment plan is going to need TFSE to work in partnership with a number of different delivery partners, both national and more local, and a number of different approaches are going to be needed depending on each particular type of scheme. And this report just provides an update on 3 particular work streams that are going on. Firstly, around the development of a delivery action plan. So we've held workshops with each of our delivery partners to understand where all of the 293 separate schemes within the Strategic Action Plan actually are at the moment, where they are in their sort of delivery or their development processes, what the roles are for the various parties, what support is required. And this information is currently being collated into a delivery action plan, which will be published alongside the final Strategic Investment Plan in March. The delivery action plan will have a particular focus on activities needed to be undertaken in the next 3 years, and it will also provide us with a baseline for monitoring the future delivery of the SIP schemes. By virtue of their inclusion within the SIP, all those 293 schemes are identified as priorities for the region in order that we can achieve the vision set out in the Transport Strategy for 2050. However, we need to recognise that individual schemes will be delivered through a number of different funding streams, and over the long term as well. Reflecting also that one of the core functions of subnational transport body is to provide advice to ministers on prioritising transport investment in our areas. The plan will also propose a methodology which will enable TFSE to filter schemes and identify priorities such as top 10 lists, whether that be in the overall context of all the schemes within the SIP or based on a number of sort of individual factors such as the funding stream. For example, something I can see coming up in the near future would be the department and National Highways asking transport, which we can do it. I think we see there's little point having ready to go lists, as it were, because of the individual circumstances. You know, is it a highway schemes we need to prioritise? Is it rail schemes? Is it overall within the region? How does that work? So we need to deliver a flexible approach that will allow us to do that. In terms of monitoring and evaluation, we also need to look at how we can demonstrate that the schemes that we said need to be delivered are actually making a difference in the region and helping us to achieve that vision, again, that we set out in the transport strategy. So again, we've held a workshop with our partners to try and understand sort of the needs for monitoring and evaluation across the region, how we can demonstrate that we are delivering, you know, those big outcomes that we said the SIP would deliver, and how that information can then be used to feed back into business cases to provide stronger evidence for the case for investment and thereby supporting our partners as well. So we held a workshop just shortly before Christmas, and the outcomes of the workshop were broadly as follows: that the further consideration needs to be given to the roles of TFSE in delivering the SIP and where responsibility and accountability actually sits. And I think that's something we're working through with the delivery action plan I mentioned earlier. It was agreed that Transport for the South East should monitor delivery of those intended outcomes and impacts of the transport strategy and SIP via something akin to a state of the region report. So reporting on some really high level metrics on an annual or biannual basis, so we can see movement towards that future we want to see in 2050. The workshop also agreed that further consideration would need to be given as to whether or not specific targets should actually be set. And I think that is very much going to come down to the individual metrics that are chosen. Some will lend themselves to setting targets, others will be more appropriate to monitor against a trajectory. And that's something that we're working through at the moment as this plan's developed. There was very broad agreement that we should monitor progress on the delivery of schemes within the SIP, as I mentioned earlier. And there was also support for schemes to undertake that post-opening project evaluation. That's something that National Highways are very good at doing for their schemes, but within local authorities, it's often something that not so much focus is given to. You know, once the scheme is implemented, it's open. You know, budget pressures often mean that there's not the opportunity to carry out that real in-depth monitoring to see whether, you know, things do deliver the outcomes that they're intended. So there was support for TFSE to look at how we could explore that through our partners. Very much here potential links into the Centre of Excellence work that Emily's leading on, and how sort of collectively we can again enhance that evidence base across the region. So further work will now be undertaken to develop monitoring and evaluation as well, and it's the intention that the first state of the region, again a sort of baseline report, will be completed by March 23 to be published alongside the strategic investment plan. Lastly, within this report is an update on where we are with the Common Analytical Framework. So regardless of which delivery route a scheme is going through, who the funding partner is, who the delivery partners are, it's likely that most of them are going to need to produce a business case in order they can demonstrate the impacts and benefits that the schemes will deliver. In order to do that, a suite of analytical tools will be needed. So we're terming that as an analytical framework. And we need to look at how, in doing so, we can work with other STBs and with other of our local authority partners. So a couple of pieces of work have been undertaken. Firstly, we've worked collaboratively with the other STBs to look at how the tools that Transport for the North have could be applicable down to Transport for the South East and the other STBs. So an analogy here, and I make no apologies for using these analogies, I've discovered over the last few weeks that they're helping people to understand the concept of analytical frameworks, would be to think of it as a toolbox. So Transport for the North have got a very well equipped toolbox. They've got all the tools you could possibly imagine in there, and Transport for the South East need to build something. So we go to the toolbox and we take out the Allen key, because that's the tool that we need to build what we're building down in the South East. We don't, however, necessarily need the screwdriver. that Transport for the North have got, so we leave it in the toolkit. It's still there, it's still available, but we don't currently need it. So looking at how the different needs of the STBs based on their investment programme require different analytical tools, and the applicability therefore of something that other people have that can be rolled out. With this piece of work, we had £300,000 in our budget for this year. However, that was held by the department pending further discussions on what we were going to use it for. We've drawn down £20,000 of that budget and commissioned Steer to produce a scoping report looking at what sort of analytical tools are specifically required to help us deliver the strategic investment plan. Alongside that, we do need to draw down the remainder of that 280,000. So we need to put a proposal to the DFT for what we're going to use that remainder of the money for. And so the report that Steer produced is Appendix 1 to this report, included in your agenda pack. Stephen is going to take you through the development of that very shortly, but just bearing in mind that there are two outcomes. One is a 3-year route map, which gets us the analytical tools we need, but there's then also a shorter term pieces of work that we could actually bring forward now to spend that remaining £280,000. So Stephen, if you're there, I know you've got a presentation to share, so perhaps we can take down the item 6 slide that's on the screens here, and I'll hand over to Stephen.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. If I go full screen, can people see my screen?
Yes.
Good. So Sarah, are you happy for me to go through? Thank you. I think Sarah covered a lot of this already, but the aims of the study or the review of the analytical framework were to identify the support that TFSE require to deliver the strategic investment plan at pace. It is an ambitious plan. What local partners require as well, principally local transport authorities, but also to support their wider programs. So, for example, local transport plan development, scheme business case development, quantified carbon reduction assessment as well. And also how this could align with the common analytical framework, which parts of the toolkit that TFN have might it be useful to apply in the TFSE context. We were commissioned to review the analytical framework and make recommendations for both the next 3 years, but as Sarah mentioned, also what work could be brought forward to draw down the remaining £280,000 this year in a sort of use it or lose it way. The work we conducted started with a scoping workshop, what the role of this study was, and it built on a triage with local authorities of their priorities over the next 3 years, as well as National Highways and Network Rail. But two key work streams, step 2A to 2C, this was a bottom-up review of all of those 290 or so interventions that are in the strategic investment plan. What would be almost the ideal analytical framework to support those interventions through scheme development to delivery. Then working with local partners, Network Rail and National Highways and DFT, to understand what exists in terms of analytical framework. And thank you to everyone who supported that work and a quick turnaround. And then step C was what's the gap between what we need and what exists currently. Steps 3A to 3C were a bit more of a top-down approach. Sarah already mentioned that Transport for the North has an extensive analytical framework which could become common across multiple subnational transport bodies, as well as WSP conducted a review of how that might be applied to different STBs. And then ANSA Digital, led by Richard Bradley, had also previously conducted a review of a very extensive analytical framework, well beyond that TFN has, that could also be applicable. So we needed to consider that as well as something more bespoke for Transport for South East, and that's resulted in an action plan, a summary of which I'll share with you shortly. So the gap analysis of those 290 or so interventions, what they need and what currently exists in terms of analytical framework, has highlighted 9 key issues or gaps. The first 3 across the top are about the existing modelling suite that's available locally or nationally. The first is the age of the data. or the age at which the models are calibrated and validated is aging, and in some instances isn't fit for purpose. Moving to the top middle, that the geographical coverage of local models either isn't detailed enough in some areas to help us model the different interventions in the strategic investment plan, or doesn't quite have enough geographical coverage. Something might span 2 local authorities or 3 local authorities, and the model simply doesn't cover the right geography. And then the third one on the top there about functionality. For example, we might be interested in a rail scheme. Perhaps the model helps us predict the demand for that rail scheme, but it doesn't help us model the improvements in reliability and performance that the scheme offers, and therefore we don't have the functionality existing locally. Across the middle, we understand that we are still very much in resource-constrained times, and often local transport authorities don't have sufficient numbers of staff or capability within their staff to progress the modelling and analysis of certain schemes. In the middle, the rail analytical framework that exists nationally, and it is principally nationally, locally it's quite scant, but even then the national models available don't necessarily capture all rail impacts. As I mentioned, very good on sort of understanding the demand of incremental schemes such as a new station or an increased frequency of service, but transformational schemes or schemes that are about reliability or performance aren't covered. On the right hand side there, National Highways, as Sarah mentioned, are thinking about the RIS3 programme on the strategic road network and supporting interventions. What opportunities are there for TFSE and local partners to help better make the case for intervention on the strategic road network and interventions aligned to that, working in partnership? Across the bottom, we understand the need to have the analytical tools that help us assess the carbon impacts of the interventions we're seeking to deliver, and that's not just tailpipe emissions, but also embedded carbon. Because we understand for some infrastructure, the embedded carbon can be 80% of all emissions, and what travels along the infrastructure or through the infrastructure being just 20%. The national TRIP-N models, getting quite technical here, often underrepresents the levels of development proposed in the 60 or so local planning authorities' local plans. There's a disjoint there, but so much of modelling, if it's to meet national standards, needs to use the national TRIP-N model and data aligned to that. So there's a disjoint there that needs resolving. And then finally, whilst there are appraisal tools for walking, wheeling, cycling and scooting interventions, there isn't a consistent approach to how you assess demand. So that was the bottom-up gap analysis. And then if we start to look top down, already mentioned a number of different scenarios were considered. Scenario A is resulting from that work from Answer Digital that would take TFSE's analytical framework way beyond that of Transport for the North. So potentially creating additional tools to put into the national or common toolbox. Then we looked at scenario B1, that is a full adoption of Transport for the North analytical framework. Scenario B2 is looking at which bits of that are most applicable or useful for TFSE. And then the third, scenario C across the bottom there, was creating something wholly bespoke for Transport for the South East and its partners. Our assessment of those different scenarios concluded that to develop, if like a UK leading analytical framework in terms of its extent, coverage, performance, or even full adoption of Transport for the North would be disproportionate to the needs of Transport for the South East and its partners. It would be expensive. The time taken to develop it would put a brake on actual scheme development and delivery of schemes within the SIP that are able to go faster than others. And there'd be a surplus of functionality that TFSE simply doesn't require. As we worked through the different scenarios, we increasingly realised that partial adoption of the SIF and something bespoke for TFSE weren't really mutually exclusive, offered better value for money, was more proportionate and flexible for the needs of TFSE and its partners, and would help us get underway more quickly. And therefore, that was our recommendation that we look at partial adoption of TFS's analytical framework as part of a common analytical framework nationally and met the needs of TFSE and its partners locally. I'm about to share with you a very high-level summary of the action plan, and as Sarah mentioned, the full document is an appendix to the partnership board papers. We've identified 7 work areas to progress over the next 3 years that help fill those gaps identified. A summary of what those tasks are, who would lead each work stream. So this isn't who would lead the delivery of the schemes, but the delivery of the work stream, the technical analytical framework work stream. Whether any of that work can be brought forward to access that £280,000 that's outstanding within this financial year to the end of March, and some indicative costs in broad bands. Again, there's much more detail in the appended annex. Sarah, are you happy for me to keep going through this one, or do I pass to you?
No, if you
Keep
go through
going?
this one, and
Okay.
then I'll take it from the next one. Thank you.
Thank you. So 7 work streams are, the first of which is to continue the development of a common analytical framework. So this is working with TfN and other subnational transport bodies in bolstering the analytical framework and working out what would be most applicable to TFSE in this instance. And there may also be opportunities for TFSE to develop tools that in turn could be helpful to other subnational transport bodies. The second is there are a large number of rail schemes, and we could support perhaps 10 to 15 of those at reasonable cost in the next 3 years, and help them get to strategic outline business case stage. There is an assumption behind all of this that TFSE doesn't support schemes beyond SOBC stage, because really there should be a central government or other combination of funding sources before those schemes are developed to that stage. I guess it would be akin to kind of, I can't think of what the toolkit analogy would be right now, but essentially, unless there's a funding source for those schemes, it wouldn't be prudent to develop them to anything beyond SOBC stage. Similarly, on the highways network, again, there are a number of interventions identified for the strategic road network, and we'll be working with National Highways on those. And then also a number of multimodal interventions on the highway network on local roads that would support bus active travel, as well as the efficiency of the highway network and safety of it more generally. Mass transit, there are a dozen or so major mass transit interventions that will require quite complex analytical frameworks. We've been trying to emphasize in earlier discussions with local partners the sheer cost of bringing forward mass transit schemes. So that could be light rail transit, tram train, heavy rail, bus rapid transit, that in the next 3 years, it's most likely that we're looking at things like feasibility studies and initial analytical framework development. Active travel, I've already mentioned that there isn't a consistent approach to demand forecasting, not an immediate priority to have that analytical framework. It's possible to progress schemes at pace without it, but it would be useful and perhaps also feed into the common analytical framework to have some further research in that area in year 2. Then there's development of TFSE's existing analytical framework, principally CELAM, the Southeast Economy and Land Use Model, that support, and there could be further research about understanding latest site allocations and quantum of development, working with local planning authorities on their latest local plan work. And then finally, none of this is achievable without additional TFSE staff to support, and in some instances licenses to use the software. And if you've built the analytical framework, you need to maintain it, and that has costs as well. So I'll now pass back to Sarah.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and hopefully that's sort of given you a bit more of an overview rather than just reading the report. I think suffice to say, we do absolutely support the idea of an STB, Common Analytical Framework, but within that also need to recognise that there will always be the need for some bespoke work as well. An analogy here, which has helped people understand that concept as well, is that if you imagine you would like a bookcase, and you're looking around at all the different available options, and you could go and buy one off the shelf, you could buy a flat pack version, you could go and buy some wood from B&Q and make your own bookcase. You've got all these options. And you think, well, actually, I quite like that IKEA bookcase. So you go to IKEA and you pop the box in your car and you come home and you've got an IKEA bookcase, except you haven't quite. You still have to build it in your own home. and then you need to put your own books on it. And that's very much the concept of the Common Analytical Framework, that because TFN have a tool, we could have it, but we would still need to make it applicable to our region and then feed it with our own data. So there's lots to be gained from working together, and undoubtedly benefits in saving time, saving money, learning from work that TFN have done, but it won't get us everything we need straight away. So there'll always be a bit of a need for some bespoke analysis. And as Stephen said, some schemes in particular, mass transit, will actually need bespoke analysis just because of the type of scheme they are, because those things don't agree. So hopefully that sort of try to put it into terms that are more easily recognisable. Stephen, if you could move on to the next slide, please. As Stephen has said, the table he's just talked you through is around the 3-year route map, which we are seeking the board's agreement to progress with. But then also referring back to what we said earlier, there was this outstanding £280,000 of funding from this year that hasn't yet been drawn down. So we've looked within that 3-year route map for tasks that could be brought forward quite quickly. And in doing so, we've been very sort of aware of the need to support that common analytical framework working across STBs, supporting our local partners in the work they're doing, looking to work that would support ongoing TFSE's technical work programme, but also work that's within our control. So in terms of getting that £280,000 spent quite quickly, we have more control over some of these items than we do of others. So there's a number of things there on your screen, which is also in Appendix 3 within the report, that we could believe we can get on with now. And so, as well as agreement to the 3-year route map, we're also seeking agreement to approach the DFT with these specific tasks to look at drawing down that funding for this year. As you'll see, they're predominantly around enhancing our own capability with our CELAM, although obviously Transport for the North has NELAM, England's Economic Heartland has ELAM. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce that one, too many E's in it. So, although it will be in the short term enhancing our capability, it's then something that can be rolled out to others. And then also looking at that common analytical framework, working with the other STBs as well, and particularly around carbon, around common data standards, which is where we really see the sort of crux of a common analytical framework sitting. And then around a proof of concept. So looking to use TFN's rail modelling systems they've developed to see whether it would be applicable to analyse schemes that we have in our area. So we wouldn't at this stage propose a wholesale transporting of the model down south. We would look for a very similar scheme to some that we have in our investment programme, but located in the north, and then test whether it would give us the sort of information we were looking for. So there's some short-term impacts on that slide, but also then the longer 3-year route map as well. That's it from Stephen and I, Chair. I'm obviously happy to take any questions or queries that anybody might have. I believe you're still on mute.
Sorry, I try to be helpful and turn the thing off as I ask others, but I forget sometimes. Must be my age, I think. I was just saying, Andy, before we go into general conversation, is there anything from your side you want to add? Or
thanks, Ted. Just to say, supportive of the approach. I think I like the toolbox analogy, Sarah. I hadn't heard that before. I think our intention, just on an efficiency basis, is actually if someone's got a toolbox full of stuff that can be used by others, let's get that done. So I think the approach that you're taking, Stephen and Sarah, is absolutely right to assess, where the gaps are, to understand what can be reused with minimal adaptation, and actually to go for the no regrets updating stuff that we all know is a feature of models, whether they be road, rail or multimodal. So it's absolutely supportive of the approach. I think it stands us in good stead as we move into the next stage of developing the schemes within SIP.
Thanks, Andy. Daniel, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. First of all, that was a really helpful, very clear paper, set things out very clearly and demonstrating that there is rigour in the process, which is great. So it's impossible to pick it to bits from a position of ignorance like mine. Questions though. First of all, are we going to be making sure that we don't diverge from the CAF any more than necessary, and are we making sure that we can always go back to it if we need more So in other words, if TfL and other STBs develop modules or do development work on what already exists, we don't want to be precluded from benefiting from that in future. That's a sort of half statement, half question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the sort of analogy, going back to the toolbox analogy, would be that maybe we've taken TfN's Allen key, we've left their screwdriver in the box, but we've actually developed our own spanner. So when we finish with our spanner, we then put our spanner back in the box, and then everybody can have the spanner as well as the Allen key that we used in the first place. So yes, absolutely. I think the data is the sort of core data standards would allow us to do that far easier, which is why that's sort of such a core part of it. But yeah, there's the intention that the toolbox doesn't preclude STBs from having something bespoke to their area, but in doing so, that should then be able to be fed back in to be available to everybody else as well.
And vice versa. So we'll avoid excessive divergence from what the rest of the good. That I assumed that was the case, but wanted it to be put on record. The next question is that 280k and the breakdown of little pieces of work. Who are you envisaging will do that work?
So some of it will by necessity be Steer, because they own the system that operates Sealum. So we have Sealum. We've obviously invested an awful lot of money in building Sealum and having it. So that will be done via a direct award through to Steer. The other parts around the Common Analytical Framework will be working in consultation with other STBs. So I think we'll need to perhaps work through that. How's the best place to do it? Obviously, if we tried to do a proof of concept by seeing whether TfN's rail model would fit something in the southeast, we would probably end up needing to pay TfN to do that. So there are some small sort of things, but yeah, the Sealum stuff.
You sort of are. So I have no problem with either of those points. Stephen and Steer have done a great job for us. That recorded. And I was going to ask whether we would go back to TfN and say, can you develop it? The big question, of course, then, which I think is going to be open at this point, is do all those parties have the available resources? Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think Andy probably come in here to support that, looking across all the STBs at how we do work together and the methods for doing that, whether it is that TfN are given more sort of resource or money to work on our behalf. Clearly, if that were the case, we would need to set up service level agreements amongst ourselves to make sure that those processes are in place.
Thank you.
Anything to add, Andy, or you're all right with that?
No, I'd say that's absolutely right. But the thrust from us is, to get the maximum benefit out of the investment that whichever STBs put into the work. So if we can share around, we'll definitely look to do that and facilitate that.
Thank you. Tony, followed by Jeff, please.
And thanks for the presentation. I suppose the first question is really to Andy, because I'm not, whilst obviously we welcome the fact that the DFT is funding this, it's the extent to which this will be of benefit across the country and the extent to which we can hope that this represents a approach by the DFT that will then apply at their assessment end. Clearly, there will be variations within local STBs, but what I'm having difficulty getting my head around is the extent to which this is work that the DFT is authorising with a view to it applying across the country as much as possible, or whether this is TFSE focused, and we therefore have the danger of each subnational transport body doing its own thing. So that's the first question. On the next point, and it's to welcome the quantified carbon reduction and the issue of embedded carbon, because this is a very important issue, and we touched on this in the SIP discussions. How extensive is this intended to be? Because I raised and I've used this example before, in terms of assessing, for example, the promotion of new electric cars. the extent to which the embedded carbon in the manufacture of those vehicles, the batteries and all the rest of it, will be properly reflected in any assessment, because tailpipe emissions are just one very small part. And the promotion of electric vehicles, as in the promotion of all cars, has huge carbon impacts, not only within the country, but other parts of the globe, which is why some of us have said we want to see fewer cars of all sorts, rather than this obsession with promoting a one-for-one replacement of already congested roads with electric vehicles. So, and in terms of reassuring our critics who rightly raised some concerns during the SIP consultation, I think this whole wider issue of embedded carbon assessment is critically important to the process of scheme evaluations. And the final point is regarding the initial slide that Stephen put up and around local transport authority resources. And clearly we are under pressure. I would humbly, without wanting to see the DfT taking it out against us in terms of reduced grant, point out that the DfT has resourcing issues. And I am more than a bit frustrated to hear reports of what I can only describe as excessive micromanagement by the department around, for example, some of the BSIP rollout. And I would suggest, and I know it's not Andy's decision around how these resources are deployed, but I would suggest that we might humbly suggest to the department that once having gone through all those assessments, they do at some stage have to let go as to the number of bus stops, the design of the flags and all the rest of it. And then that leads on to the resourcing within the private sector. And I've had worrying examples shown to me and reports from other authorities that in terms of commissioning work to support BSIP rollout and other active travel schemes, the private sector is also under pressure. So that wider resourcing, local authorities, DfT and the private sector is one that I'm sure quite a number of authorities are encountering. So it's a need to look at that bigger picture and not to assume that somehow it's all local authority suffering resource issues. And it's of course a case of delegating to us tasks that perhaps the department with the work that's been commissioned don't necessarily need to do in quite so much detail in the future. End of homily, Chair.
Well, I was going to stop you halfway through just to say your contribution is wide-ranging and probably just a bit outside of this agenda item.
I don't think so, Keith. With respect, they were raised at the beginning. All of these were points that were raised. But anyway, I've finished.
Okay. Well, I won't add to the pain then. I'll. Andy, did you want to come back on that before we move on, or shall I go to Rupert first?
No, I'm very, very happy to. Keith, Councillor Page's points are all good points as ever. The intention, I'll try and answer them in the order in which they were asked. The intention is that this will apply across the piece. So this is, this hopefully is the best of TFSE using work that's already been done by TFN, but adapting it for local circumstances and the local models that you have in your area. So I'm hopeful that that is the best of both. The intention is definitely not for wheels to be invented in all the corners of the country. It is to maximise the benefit of the work that's been done generically by TFN. I picked up the point about embedded carbon, which is a really good point with the policy team when you last raised it, Councillor Page, and I'm assured that the guidance will include some assessment of that, but I will take that back again to satisfy myself that is the case. And then finally, the micromanagement piece, I think actually, if I'm quite candid with the board, I recognise some of that in colleagues. And if that is acceptable to the board, I'll pick up separately with Rupert Clubb a bit of evidence gathering on that, because Rupert and I, between us, are quite up for challenging some of the less enlightened parts of the department, if I can put it that way.
Thank you, Andy. Rupert, did you want to come in before I come to Jeff?
I can do just a couple of points. I mean, the first thing on how we procure these services, I mean, just to give members the assurance that this will be done in accordance with the accountable body standing orders for procurement. I just want to make that point. On resourcing, I mean, Tony makes a really important point, I think, about skills, capacity and capability. You know, it is across the department, it is across local transport authorities, and I know that STBs have found it quite a difficult environment to recruit in. And, you know, to my mind, that helps illustrate the importance of common analytical frameworks, removing duplication, working together. And only last week, Andy and I met with the 6 other STB chief officers to exactly ensure that we are not duplicating, we are sharing resource. And, you know, my colleagues around the country are in exactly the same place on this. We also recognise there's constraint in the private sector. You know, they're fishing in the same pool as well for resource. So anything that we can do to remove duplication, improve consistency in the longer term has to have a benefit. On the skills bit generally, Martin Tugwell and Naomi Green from England's Economic Heartland are working with the DFT and others around skills and trying to ensure we're in a better place for the future. It's a bit of a long-term burn, I have to say, because people with the right sort of skills, transport planners, case in point, you know, don't fall off the tree immediately. And, you know, we are talking about how do we invest in the next generation? So more emphasis on things like apprentices and technical apprenticeships to ensure that as we go forward, we are in a strong place. And I think the final point that to my mind that Tony mentioned was around BSIP. So I think, you know, credit to Andy, who has pulled together the local roads team to help, you know, streamline some of these processes, give much greater understanding of how STBs can support the delivery of DFT policies and support our local transport authorities in their ambitions, I think has been really helpful. We've still got a bit of work to do on that, but I think it will avoid in future, Tony, the points that you've exampled with BSIP and other projects.
Thank you, Rupert. Jeff.
Yeah, slightly different point, and it's as we move on here and the next steps, what safeguards do we need to have in place to either ensure that 1 or 2 really big projects don't dictate everything and swallow up all the funds, and or that smaller projects will be, which might seem very small and petty compared with the big schemes, get a fair crack of the whip? That's much more of an implementation thing, I know, but that's a sort of concern going forward.
Okay, Rupert.
I mean, I suppose it's an important point because sometimes it's the smaller schemes that can give you a much greater return.
Yeah.
I think there's 2 or 3 things that come to my mind. The first is that the transport strategy and the strategic investment plan set the overall ambition for the region, and that should be what drives national highways, network rail, you know, bus operator ambition, and so on and so forth, active travel interventions at a strategic scale, and so on and so forth. So the transport strategy and the SIP provide the evidence base and the schemes that we think should take place in order to meet our overall ambition. And if you go back to the economic connectivity review, you know, we set that out there. Each scheme will have to go through its respective business cases, you know, to make sure it stacks up. And you heard Stephen talk about, you know, getting things to SOBC, and then, you know, we need that funding certainty as things go on. And of course, with the SIP comes a sequencing, you know, the approach that you would, in order in which you would deal with some things. So, for example, much of the rail interventions, they are going to take a while to work through their business case. They're really, really important and we mustn't lose track of them, but they are complicated pieces of work that might take longer than, say, for a specific improvement on an existing corridor. on a roads corridor, for example. So the phasing and sequencing is quite important, and I don't think the way in which we've structured it means that the situation that you've just described, Jeff, will occur, because we've got the sequencing right, we've got the priorities agreed. That is what drives delivery bodies' programs, and bingo, you know, you get smaller schemes delivered with some of the larger ones.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert. No other question. Sarah, did you cover off the discussions with local authorities, or did you want to add something on that?
No, I don't think there's anything to add on that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay. No other questions. So we have the recommendations before us on the screen. Are we happy to support those?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. No one's objecting. Thank you. So we come to the financial update, and Rachel, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the finance paper, a lot of the detail that I'm going to talk through is already included in the paper. But the three main aims of the paper are to look at the current financial position to the end of Q3, provide a short update on the discussions with the Department for Transport around our funding for the next financial year, and to highlight that we've started work on the business plan and annual report. So turning our attention to the end of Q3 budget update, Appendix 1 includes the spend position to the end of December 22 and also sets out a proposed forecast to the end of March. Unsurprisingly, the main elements of expenditure relate to delivering the technical programme, mainly around delivery of the strategic investment plan and the staffing costs. And so far, year to date, we have just spent over 1.4 million. Staffing costs have been slightly lower than expected at just under 500,000, and that's due to the delays in recruiting the full complement of staff. And then we've spent more than £900,000 on the technical programme. We're forecasting that we will spend just over 1.8 million on the technical programme by the end of March 2022, but we will continually review the forecasts as the end of financial year approaches. I wanted to highlight that we are at the minute forecasting that there's going to be about £1.2 million worth of technical programme spend to be carried forward into 23-24. That includes the funding for the Centre of Excellence and the analytical framework that we haven't yet drawn down from the Department for Transport, and we expect to be made available to us in March. The vast majority of the carry forward is going to be for existing work streams and ring fence for specific activities, or it will already be committed. We are predicting that carry forward, and part of the reason for that and the rationale for that is up until now, our funding settlements have been provided in year or just before the start of the financial year, which has made it a little bit more difficult to plan for and to start our procurement activity and recruitment activity early. However, now that we do have allocated indicative funding settlements for future years, we do expect the level of carry forward to reduce in the next financial year. That moves us forward to our grant funding for 23-24. The DfT provided a multi-year indicative funding allocation in March 2022. The intention of that was to allow us to use it for business planning purposes, and the indicative allocation for TFSE in the financial year 23-24 is 2.065 million. The funding's not yet confirmed, and we are required to submit a business plan to DfT as part of the funding discussions. What we have done is in Appendix 2, we've included a draft high-level budget for that 2.065 million and how we intend that allocation to be used. Appendix 2 will evolve as the carry forward for the next financial year is confirmed. We are having conversation.
Fuck's sake! Hey, somebody's got a mic on and using some pretty strong language. Sorry, Sarah.
That's okay. So just in terms of we are having the conversations with DfT around the confirmation of that indicative funding allocation, and we will report back to the board in March. And then finally, as in previous years, we are publishing both a retrospective annual report and a forward-looking business plan. Appendix 3 includes a skeleton outline of the annual report, and Appendix 4 includes a skeleton outline of the business plan. The intention is that we will continue to work on these documents, and we will return them to the board in March of this year for sign-off. So in terms of the recommendations, they are as outlined on screen. The board are asked to note the current financial position at the end of December, note the position on funding discussions with the Department for Transport, and note that work has commenced on the business plan and annual report.
Thank
you.
Rachel. Are there any questions or comments? Daniel.
I'm assuming those interjections were not in response to what you were saying, Rachel. I don't think they were. Could you expand a tiny bit, and apologies if you already feel you have done, on the biggest discrepancies between the budget and the forecast, which look like they are, I mean, I noticed the analytical framework, which we've already touched on a bit, 280k, and the supporting the DFT priorities, which is about, where are we, 400k. The worry always with these things is that we've underspent, and it is practically impossible to spend up to the level, and there are some reasons that we need to delve into. So could you do a bit of a quick delve for us right now?
Yes, absolutely. So in terms of the difference between the analytical framework and the Centre of Excellence, I'll take those two first. As we've previously updated board members, we were originally asked by the department to do some further work on those two work streams to help us draw down the funding. We've been in discussions with the department about how best to enable us to draw down that funding, but it's unlikely that we're going to receive the money until March of this year, which means that we aren't going to be able to spend it by the end of this financial year. So we have agreed with the DFT that we would be able to carry forward that money and use it next year. In terms of the support and DFT priorities, that budget line, board members will remember that we were asked to do some work on 4 additional work streams, which were decarbonisation, local capability, EV charging, and Bus Back Better. That money, when we originally put this budget together, we were meant to have received that money for the additional work streams back in, oh goodness, let me try and get my years right now. That money was meant to come to us in September or October of 2021, and the intention was that it would have been spent by the end of March this year. However, we only received that £700,000 worth of funding in the February time, which again made it very difficult for us to spend in last financial year. That rolled forward, and that has impacted on the additional money that we'd included in our budget for those 4 additional work streams. We have been having a lot of conversations internally about how we can deliver against that in the next financial year. It is going to give us quite a large technical budget for the next year, but because we now have the staff and resource in place, and because of the fact that we've got the indicative funding allocation, which allows us to start some of our procurement work early, we are confident that we would be able to spend it in the next financial year, and as the report outlines, reduce our carry forward in the next financial year. Okay,
so we're happy we can do it, and the funder is happy that we will do it.
Absolutely.
Perfect. I know, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah. Good. No other comments or questions? So you have the recommendations in front of you on the screen. We'll take those as approved. Thank you.
Yep. Great. Yep.
So we come to agenda item 8, which is the governance subgroup update. And Tony, I think you're going to take us through this, please.
Thank you, Keith. Well, I'm going to take you through everything except item 3, where I would ask that Rachel or Rupert step in so I don't trip up over the legal concepts of holding things harmless. So let me deal with the other points first, Keith. We met on the 12th of January, as the paper says. In terms of the TFSE constitution, that's now been added to the website and updated in terms of membership. So that is sorted. If we could just skip to Audit and Governance Committee. This will become operational in April 2023, and paragraph 4.4 recommends a number of members to go on to that committee. I'd like to propose, in terms of the 5th bullet, that we add Councillor Joy Dennis from West Sussex County Council. I think Joy's with us today, and I understand that she would be keen and willing to join the Audit and Governance Committee. And one of the key initial tasks will be to consider then the role of co-opted board members, as is said in paragraph 4.4. And Appendix 1 sets out the draft terms of reference for the Audit and Governance Committee, which we have considered before. But if we could formally agree that today, Chair, that would be helpful. The Transport Forum, we're also recommending that the Audit and Governance Committee leads a review of the Transport Forum, and Jeff French might want to say a few words about that, as it's not been the subject of any review since being created in 2017. With regard to the intra-authority agreement, I would just ask if Rupert or Rachel just want to add a few words about the 2 changes that are proposed to the agreement, and that's the hold harmless clause and then the issue of third-party contracts. Other than that, Chair, once they've spoken, happy to take any questions. So perhaps I could hand over to Rupert or Rachel in respect of the IAA.
2019, when it was drafted very much with a view to TFSE obtaining statutory status and becoming its own legal entity. It sets out the arrangements to formalise the partnership, and it shares the risk across the 16 local transport authorities that form the constituent authorities of Transport for the South East. Because of the where we are in terms of the ongoing partnership arrangements, it feels that it's timely to review the intra-authority agreement, particularly as we head into the delivery of the SIP. And working with the legal team and the accountable body, we are suggesting 2 high-level changes to the intra-authority agreement to reflect the current status of Transport for the South East. The first one of these is what we would term a hold harmless clause. This is it's something that you would hear more in America in terms of legal speak, but it does have relevance in the UK. And the hold harmless clause would be a new clause within the intra-authority agreement, which would ask all constituent authorities to hold harmless the lead authority in respect of any liabilities that could arise under a third-party contract. And as an example of that, we've got a number of authorities who are currently undertaking work on behalf of TFSE, for example, through the local capability work stream. And all of those pieces of work entail the use of consultancy advice, and the outputs are going to be shared more widely across the TFSE partnership. If, say, for example, one of the bits of consultancy advice that we received under that work stream were incorrect and then used by another authority, the hold harmless agreement would protect any authority who was undertaking work on behalf of TFSE from legal challenge from another authority within the partnership. So it's really there to protect all of the authorities that could be asked to undertake work on behalf of Transport for the South East, and in particular the accountable body in its role of undertaking work on behalf of Transport for the South East. The second point links to that, and it's about the role of the lead authority in entering into third-party contracts. And at the minute, the way that the intra-authority agreement is drafted is that it gives the status to the lead authority as the contracting party on behalf of TFSE, and says that the lead authority will undertake the works on behalf of TFSE. TFSE is at the point now where actually we use the accountable body to set up the legal agreements, but actually TFSE is responsible for defining the specifications and for undertaking that work. So it will just clarify the role of TFSE as a sort of a contractor in terms of entering into those third-party contracts. So they're the two changes that we have put forward, and very happy to take any questions on them.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments either for Tony or Rachel?
Only because Tony said I might like to say.
Oh yes,
something.
please, Jeff.
Go on,
Yeah.
Jeff.
Yeah. No, what I was going to come back to it under the Transport Forum actually.
Yep.
Because the question I asked a few minutes ago was almost part of that process, and how we deal with the forum going forward. Do we keep the same numbers or whatever? But let me deal with that under item 11, please, Keith.
Yeah. Okay, that'd be good, Jeff. Thank you for that. So if there are no other questions or comments, we've got Ian. Ian.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, just a quick point about the other constituent authority representative on the Audit and Governance Committee. Any proposals on who that should be? Because I've got a suggestion that perhaps it should be the LEP member.
Well, you obviously, Ian, you obviously missed it, because I've proposed. In my introduction, I specifically proposed that Councillor Joy Dennis from West Sussex should be that representative.
I'm sorry, I got distracted at that. That'll teach me to pay better attention.
I mean, that doesn't preclude adding necessarily a further member, does it, Rupert? I mean, it's not as though we have set ourselves, this is the totality of the membership, is it?
No, that's true. I mean, what I'd suggest, Chairman, is that if the Audit and Governance Committee meets at its first meeting, it can determine whether or not it's appropriate to expand the membership further. What is key, and the way we've tried to structure it, is you'll recall that we follow the intent of the Cities and Local Devolution Act and how we operate. Yeah. And that sets out the relevant authorities for a subnational transport body being the local authorities. And the local authorities then choose, and you'll recall this, to co-opt members to provide richness to the board debate. So you agreed to include the LEPs and Transport Forum and protected areas and so on and so forth. So I think probably the sensible thing to do is at your first meeting consider whether you want to add to that.
I think that's sensible, and Ian, we note your the suggestion you've just made, with which I have some sympathy, but let's pick that up at the first meeting of the committee then in April.
Thank you for that, Tony, and Keith. I promise to pay close attention to the rest of the meeting. Sorry, I missed that bit.
No problem. Daniel.
Yes, well, thank you, Ian, for putting your hand up for the LEPs. Can I suggest that, because Jeff is already on the list of attendees for governance, and he does have a LEP past, maybe he could make sure that that particular point is raised at the first meeting. And I'm sure that Vince or I would be happy to join should that be deemed necessary. But I hear your point, Rupert, about the fact that and I'm very conscious that this is a local authority-led movement, and the LEPs are grateful to be included, although we are, of course, essential to be included. I have to say.
But of course, Daniel.
Let's be very clear. In my mind, we are one team. At the end of the day, there is a statutory response. Well, not statutory, otherwise we would not be here. But there is an understanding that this is an association of the local transport bodies. So the other people are there to give it the fullness that this committee needs. So and this whole organisation needs. So if we can do that at the next meeting. I take it that we can accept the recommendations as printed. Yep. So we then move on to the technical programme update. And Mark, I think you're going to provide that, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I've got 6 items, 6 elements of the technical work programme just to provide an update on. First of which is the work we have ongoing on Bus Back Better, which was a DFT priority work stream that was identified back in October 2021. So we currently have MOTS and ARUPS, a consortium MOTS and ARUPS engaged with us to what we've done so far is stage one of the work was to identify what help our local transport authorities felt they needed to accelerate and move forward the development and implementation of their bus service improvement plans, both where these have been funded or not funded. So stage one finished just before Christmas, and stage two consisted of the actual delivery of 11 packages of support. These are set out in Appendix 1 to the paper. You can see the package of support that we're in the process of delivering. We have quite a full program of engagement through a website that we've developed, plus some newsletters to promote the rollout of these support packages to our constituent authorities. That work is ongoing and due to be completed by the end of April. In the process, working with Arcadis to develop an electric vehicle charging infrastructure strategy for the TFSE area. The work that's been completed today included a sort of policy review in terms of where all of our constituent authorities currently are with this work area, undertaking some baseline forecasts, some baselining of current levels of uptake of EVs and how those are likely to change in the future. Currently, some work ongoing on the development of some forecasts for future uptake of EVs and the resulting requirement in terms of charging infrastructure. And then so the last work packages actually that are now starting, which is to actually produce the strategy and action plan document. Quite a lot of engagement with this work stream, a strategy steering group and an EV infrastructure forum, which have provided mechanism for the key stakeholders and partnership that needs to come together to accelerate the rollout of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, very much being facilitated through that forum. We also have a specific work stream on the electrification of the vehicle fleet with a particular package of the work which we were asked to undertake by the DFT, looking at the potential impact of the electrification of the vehicle fleet, particularly on public infrastructure demand, charging infrastructure. So all of this work coming together in the delivery of a strategy and action plan, which we'll be bringing to the board in March 2023. But in terms of the development of a methodology for the understanding what the implications of the rollout of fleet electrification on public infrastructure provision, there's a recommendation we see to enable us to take forward that stage 2 work. Just moving into the future mobility area, members of the board will recall that a future mobility strategy was agreed by the board back in 2021, now very much in the process of implementing the strategy and action plan. We have WSP currently engaged to help us with that, supporting the continued work of the Future Mobility Forum, which we've reinvigorated. We have a working group coming up very shortly as a sort of a subgroup of that forum, looking at the impact of or looking at future mobility in a rural context. And they're currently developing some briefs for some further study work around a shared knowledge hub, a mode propensity tool, and potentially a future propulsion strategy. And again, a recommendation in the report that we're able to move forward with that study work as and when those briefs have been put together. Just moving on to freight, we currently have in terms of the implementation of the freight strategy, which the board agreed last year. Looking at a short piece of work, just looking at the provision of lorry parking facilities within the southeast, just getting an understanding of the potential need for further infrastructure, in line very much with some work that's gone on nationally to look at this important issue and a major problem for the efficient operation of the freight sector. We're currently just producing a request for quotes to go out to the market to engage consultants to help us re-establish the freight forum that we had working with us during the development of the freight strategy, and also to produce some briefs for some further study work a property market review, looking at the provision of warehousing facilities within the southeast and what potentially needs to be done to increase supply. The potential role of coastal shipping in encouraging the modal shift from road to potentially water-based freight transport. An important piece of work potentially on overcoming the issue of public freight sector blindness, this issue that the public sector doesn't have enough of an understanding of the needs and requirements of the freight sector, and what work could we do as TFSE to help build that partnership and look at some specific modules that would improve relationships between the public and private sectors. And also a potential study brief on the production of some consolidation guidance. We've also got some work ongoing on looking at alternative fueling for the freight sector, looking at some potential sites, being sort of agnostic about the fuel type, whether that might be hydrogen or electric in the future, but starting to look at where these sites might possibly be in the future, so we can start to see what work might be needed to develop the implementations of those. Just moving on to decarbonisation, a specific work stream again identified as a DFT priority, obviously a priority for TFSE, but some specific funding came to us through it being identified as an area that the DFT wanted us to take forward. And a very important joint piece of work that we're undertaking with England's Economic Heartlands and Transport East, with England Economic Heartlands being the lead authority on lead SDB on this one, to develop a tool which will enable our local transport authorities to respond to the forthcoming quantifiable carbon reduction guidance, which will come out as part of the new local transport plan guidance that Rupert made reference to in his opening remarks. Very much development of a tool that will enable local transport authorities on a consistent basis to understand their current baseline level of emissions, look at potential trajectories to net zero on a consistent basis, identify the emissions gaps between what the current levels of emissions are within their geography and what would need to what the gap is in terms of emissions reductions that would be needed to get to net zero, and importantly what the impact of different potential measures at a very high level, different packages of measures would have in delivering those carbon reductions. So a very important piece of work, a lot of engagement going on with the local transport authorities to, although we haven't seen the guidance as yet, very much trying to anticipate and make sure as far as possible what that tool does will answer the requirements of that guidance when it comes out. We understand it's I think the current DFT guide in the last bulletin was issued was spring 2023. Andy may possibly have an update on that. Just lastly, on local capability, another DFT priority work stream. An extensive program of engagement went on last year in terms of the identifying some suitable projects to be taken forward with this funding, looking at projects that will help local transport authorities deliver their local transport priorities and ancillary work. A number of projects, as set out in the report, have now been identified to be taken forward. We have some comms training work undergoing in both Wokingham and in Brighton and Hove. So a further funding, £102,000 funding to help Solent Transport update their regional transport model. We would obviously see the returns of that in terms of feeding back into the development of the common analytical framework. Some money for Kent to take forward training on quantifiable carbon reduction, which will be made available to all of the constituent authorities within the TFSE area. And finally, an amount of funding to Hampshire County Council to produce some guidance on the providing advice on the implementation of local transport plans. So that was just a very quick run through the various elements of the technical programme, and the recommendations are as shown on the screen. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. It's very clear to me the the amount of work that continues at a pace is quite extensive. So well done to all of the team and all of our consultants. It certainly is moving in the right direction. Comments or questions? Ian?
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, Mark, I assume neither air traffic nor shipping get included in the decarbonisation studies, but if they aren't, are they picked up anywhere else at a national or regional level? I know sort of the emissions relating to Farnborough and Gatwick, for example, are something that been concerning the national park.
In terms of the tool that we're currently developing, no, they're not. The focus of that is obviously on surface transport, which obviously the emissions, those are the emissions which a local transport authority has the ability to control. So air and shipping are not part of that. And obviously there would need to be, there are other mechanisms nationally that would need to be undertaken. We very much hear about the in terms of aircraft fuel, a national initiative to, to move forward with the converting that to biofuel. So the shipping and the air being taken forward nationally rather than through anything that we're currently engaged with at the moment.
Right, thank you. I assume that was the case.
Rupert?
Yeah, just to add on that, and very clearly aviation policy and decarbonisation associated with it, and shipping policy very much sits with the department, and it's not a role that STBs have been asked to consider, and I don't envisage that changing.
Good, thank you. Any other questions or comments? No. Well, can we take the recommendations as printed?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we come on to agenda item 10, which is communications stakeholder. Holly, and on behalf of all of us, a really big thank you for all that you've done, and best wishes in your next task. I'm sure it'll be equally as successful. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. That's very kind. Thank you. So today, just giving you an update on content engagement activity since the last Partnership Board meeting. We've continued to prepare for the formal launch of the SIP pending its final approval in March. It's a tricky time of year to try and launch the SIP, with the pre-election period beginning soon after the Partnership Board meeting. So the current proposal is that we will arrange for a formal handover of the SIP to the DFT soon after the Partnership Board meeting, and then we would look to plan a wider SIP-related event in September time of this year. We are still developing these plans and no dates have been set in stone yet, but we will share more detail as soon as they're available. Aside from the SIP launch, we've been continuing the engagement work on our additional work streams. As you've just heard from Mark in the technical update, meetings have been held for Bus Back Better, EV charging infrastructure, and for the freight and logistics projects. With the launch of the Bus Back Better support schemes, we've also been supporting with the development of the website and web content for that. There is also a fortnightly targeted newsletter, which is promoting all of the webinars and all of the documentation that's coming out of those support packages. As this is a joint project with Transport East and England's Economic Heartland, we are also sharing all of the newsletter copy and assets with them, so they're able to replicate the same level of communication in their own areas. We've got a few meetings and events coming up. We were due to have a face-to-face meeting with the Universities Group on Wednesday of this week. Just flagging, hopefully any of you that were attending will be aware that this is now happening virtually, due to low numbers being able to make it in person. Presentations and discussions will cover active travel and centres of excellence, and board members are of course welcome to join. As always, do get in touch if you would like to be invited to attend that meeting. The next private sector stakeholder group meeting will be on the 31st of January, and that is being held in London. Last week, Sarah Valentine spoke at the South East Development Conference, where she joined a panel discussion on boosting inclusive growth through major infrastructure projects, which was very well received. And some of you may have seen that we have also begun promoting this year's joint STB conference. The agenda for this event is still in development, but it will be held at the Vox in Birmingham, which is the same location as last year. And this time around, it will be on the 5th of June. That's all from the comms and stakeholder engagement team.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're asked to note the content of that report. So thank you. We move on to 11, which is the Transport Forum update. Jeff, over to you.
Thanks, Keith. And I sort of blurted out some of the issues that I can see coming forward. I think to date, the Transport Forum has provided a good way of keeping a wide range of people over a wide range of modes informed. And we've done that by presentation and discussion and by talking things through, if you like. So, for instance, we don't do sordid things like voting at the end of meetings. We usually decide that we have got to a sensible place. But it seems to me the challenge now for the forum, is why I was thinking about it earlier, and for the chair of the forum, is to identify the best way of ensuring that those debates and discussions progress at the appropriate level of detail. Because some people want to dive in to very detailed things, whereas others are looking enviously at major transport schemes to be implemented. And I think this is just, as I say, the debates and discussions we want to keep at the appropriate level, be it for public transport, for roads, for cycling and walking. And it's clear that some of the people at the forum do want to go into much more detail on certain issues than I would think was appropriate at the moment. And the challenge is just to ensure issues are discussed at the appropriate level. And I don't know whether the current membership of the Transport Forum is the right one to take forward or to put our efforts behind. Some people get a bit entrenched about what they think is the best thing for the area. I'm sure they all do it with the best interests of the area in mind, but not all of them agree with the best way forward. So whether we have to have smaller groups instead of the forum is something I think I'd like to chat about with Tony, and the way that group was being talked about earlier. It's a bit of a challenge. We want to continue. I would want to continue with the forum in some shape or form, but striking the right balance across the different transport modes, I think, is going to be a continuing difficulty. That's all.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I mean, I think it is something that we need to work out a way forward on. Not here and now, I don't think. I think it needs as you say, a wider thought about that. And it is always very difficult, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, as you say, you want the biggest participant group that you can possibly get, but equally, once you get into the depths of some of these detailed discussions, you've lost half of the audience. And so
yep.
As and when, but I'm sure we can add that in. Rupert's just going to tell us how we're going to do that, I hope.
Well, I just reflecting, actually, Chair, you recall that, back in the June 2017 meeting, when Transport for the South East formally established itself, there was a recommendation there to have a transport forum, to do all the things that Jeff has described, and to provide information and intelligence and advice to the TFSE team and then through Jeff to the board. And we haven't. We've used that transport forum through the development of the economic connectivity review and the transport strategy, and then more latterly the SIP. And we haven't reviewed it since we initially established it. And it's a timely moment given it has grown, both in terms of numbers and diversified in terms of opinion. And I think the Transport Forum chairman does an admirable job of trying to balance differing views and trying to bring that in front of you in a sort of coherent way is really, really challenging. And I think for the Audit and Governance Committee to take stock, we're 5 years on, having produced a SIP, it is a timely moment to figure out, how best to take forward what is a really valuable resource and forum, how to take that forward into the sort of next stage of the TFSE journey.
Okay, I think that's fine. Not knowing how that will work, I'm sure someone will need to put together a paper that just highlights some of the issues that can then be discussed. But we can work out the detail of that outside of this meeting. Are there any other comments or questions on the Transport Forum for Jeff? The conversation I've had with someone who's sadly a late member of the forum was always that it was inclusive, and he came away from those meetings with a nugget of something most times. So don't think that there aren't people there are gaining from it, as well as us as an organisation gaining from it. So we need to work out how to make it work best. So we'll give that some serious thought, Jeff, and thank you again for continuing to lead something that would probably be beyond my capabilities.
I had no grey hair when I started this role,
Absolutely. Well done, thank you. Rupert, agenda item 14, response to consultation.
Thank you, Chairman. There's two consultation responses there. First is in relation to consultation that East Sussex County Council are holding on their local transport plan. Your board members will probably recall we've done a number of responses so far to local transport authorities bringing those forward. And principally, we're just encouraging authorities who are taking forward their next phase of the LTP to develop them so that there's a line of sight between the transport strategy SIP, area studies, and all the evidence that we've produced to support their LTP, so they align. And then the second consultation is National Highways supplementary consultation on the A27 Arundel, and we simply just reaffirmed our support for a scheme to be part of a broader solution for the A27. As we know, the 27 is a challenging corridor, of which this specific area is just one location. We recognise the challenges that 27 brings. And we also have just highlighted the importance of them focusing and addressing some of the environmental challenges that exist for that particular section. That's all I need to say. Thank you, Chair.
Excellent. Ian.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Rupert. I appreciate the comments made in the penultimate paragraph on the A27 consultation response. But given that the National Park is undergoing ongoing discussions with National Highways on this scheme, I think it's appropriate for me to be recorded as abstaining on this issue rather than supporting it. No, I'm not sure what the recommendation was on this item. Is it simply to note or is it to approve?
So, Chairman, if I may, it is to agree the consultation responses that in some instances already sent up because of the timescale. And what we've agreed in the past is that I will bring consultation responses here for you to endorse as board members. So that's what the recommendation is.
Right, in which case I would wish to be recorded as abstaining on that agreement, on that particular item, the A27 consultation, simply because we have an ongoing situation.
I'm sure that's recorded.
Thank you.
Any other comments at all? No. Thank you. So we then come to AOB. Any other business? Now's your opportunity. No one wanting to add to today's meeting.
Correct.
Well, thank you very much for that. So just to remind you the date of the next meeting, which is the 13th of March. Hopefully it won't coincide with a action on trains or whatever, but we'll keep monitoring that. And that will be in person at the LGA at Smith Square. So
yep.
Unless you hear any different, well, I look forward to seeing you all in person on the 13th of March. And again, thank you very much for making the time today.
No problem.
See you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.